What is the role of religion in our ever-changing world? From the NewsChannel 5 network, this is Issues of Faith.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Issues of Faith. Glad you are with us. We have an important and topical issue to discuss today. We're talking about racism, how to fight racism. And we are very happy to have with us to help us unpack this difficult issue, a New York Times best-selling author. So I will introduce him now via Zoom. There is the book, How to Fight Racism, Courageous Christianity and the Journey Toward Racial Justice. It's written by Jemar Tisby. His previous book was on the New York Times bestseller list. And Jemar Tisby now joins us live via Zoom in Oxford, Mississippi. And that is where he is studying to get his PhD. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
So, all right, I want to start out with, right now everyone is divided on how to tackle this topic. I mean, division is the name of the game, and so how do we even approach it? I mean, this is such a delicate issue. We approach it, in your opinion, how?
So one of the first steps is to acknowledge that racism is not just a problem of the past, but a persistent issue in the present as well. So many of my conversations are around convincing or persuading people that this is still an urgent issue, that it didn't go away with the 1964 Civil Rights Act or the 65 Voting Rights Act, or wherever they want to place a pin in history to say that we're post-racial or we're over this issue. And so, you know, the first step is to acknowledge the problem. I would hope that after 2020 and the historic racial justice uprisings that we saw all over the country, indeed even internationally, that people would say, well, at least there's a lot of folks who care about this, and maybe because so many people care about this, there's actually something to it. So the first step is acknowledging the problem, of course, and that is no small feat in and of itself.
No, that's not a small feat. We were talking to somebody on a show last night, a professor, and he was talking about, he structured a course talking about systemic racism. And he said there are a lot of people who took the course because they don't believe systemic racism exists. They wanted to understand what systemic racism even was. And that is the debate. There are people that are very offended when we start talking about even systemic racism. And so if somebody said to you, there's no such thing as systemic racism, they're upset when they even hear it. First of all, I guess I ask you to define systemic racism, and in your opinion, is it there?
Yep. So quite simply put, systemic racism acknowledges the reality that prejudice works itself out not just through people, but through policies as well. And so you can look back throughout the course of U.S. history and see that prejudice was enshrined into policy. We can look at things like the Dred Scott decision, which said that the black man has no rights, which the white man is obligated to respect. You can look at Plessy versus Ferguson, which enshrined the doctrine of separate and equal. Of course, we know it was never equal, but we can look at other factors too, like the fact that the Federal Housing Commission enshrined into policy redlining and actually had penalties if a white family wanted to sell their home to a black family. And what's difficult for people to latch onto about the idea of systemic racism is that the past continues to impact the present. And so typically your home is your biggest sort of wealth asset. And so if you were barred from buying a home or buying home in certain areas where the value would appreciate, well, that has generational effects. I live in the Delta, and it's very apparent here how the generational poverty has worked itself out, because you can trace it back to sharecropping, which you can trace back to race-based chattel slavery. And all of that speaks to economic exploitation, that yes, the particular forms of exploitation may have ended, but the impact remains with us today.
So if somebody again says, I'm not racist, I'm colorblind, or no one I'm not racist, so how is there this systemic racism? You would say, I want to drill down into that. You would say, I think essentially what you just said, but I guess help explain that, because that's kind of an argument that you're hearing over and over. Well, I'm not. I've moved on from that. So we can move on from systemic racism.
Yeah. So, I mean, for instance, Black women die in maternity-related deaths at 3 times the rate of white women. And when you look at data like that, you basically come down with one of two explanations. Either there's something wrong with Black women, or there's something wrong with the system. And so some people who would say, they would never say there's something wrong with Black women. It'll sound like, well, they don't take care of themselves. They're not careful when they're pregnant. Those kinds of things, which, when you drill down, you're saying there's something about these people, quote unquote, that makes them unhealthier. It's similar with incarceration. 1 in 3 Black males will end up in the criminal justice system in one way or another versus 1 in 17 white males. And then you have the similar dichotomy. Either there's something wrong with Black males, and then conversely, something better about white males that they don't end up in this system. Or there's actually a difference in the way policing and law enforcement is applied across different racial groups. And those are systemic manifestations of the way that there is an imbalance and inequality in many of our systems.
So why do you think there is the reluctance to acknowledge systemic racism? And some feel like it's an attack on the country in general. But why do you think the reluctance?
I think there are several reasons. Number one, if you do sort of allow for the idea of systemic racism, then if you're white, that can implicate you. That can say that even though unintentional, there's a system where, some people have it worse than others simply because of the color of their skin. And if I'm white, maybe I have it a little bit easier. Now, this gets into the whole idea of white privilege. People hate that term. The simplest explanation I can give for white privilege is not that your life isn't hard, not that you don't face challenges, but your race doesn't make it harder for you. And that's the difference, right? Everybody can face illnesses. Everybody can face job loss. Everybody can face poverty, whatever it might be. But does your race or ethnicity make that even harder for you? So I think there's the idea that, if systemic racism is a thing, then I can sort of unconsciously be participating in it and part of the problem. The other factor is exposure. If I don't personally feel the ill effects of systemic racism, then it's harder for me to admit it. It's harder for me to understand it. It's harder for me to see where you're coming from. So it can be a variety of factors.
And so what is the response? What is the response that you feel like you're calling for courageous Christians to take a journey toward racial justice, how to fight racism? How do we deal with this?
Well, I use in the book a model called the Arc of Racial Justice, and it's an acronym that stands for Awareness, Relationships, Commitment. And I think you need all three to have a solid foundation on which to build racial justice efforts. Now, this is not a linear process. It's circular, it's dynamic. We're doing all three at once a lot of times. But awareness, we have to understand how race and racism function in our society. So that's the data, the information, the facts that we need. That means watching documentaries, listening to programs like this, reading the books. All of those things build your awareness. But we can't just have big heads about this thing and lots of knowledge. We need to actually put it into action. One of the ways that we do this is relationally. So from the perspective of faith, all reconciliation is relational on some level. We cannot forget that real people are being impacted by racism, and we have to actually cross barriers racially and ethnically and even culturally speaking to humanize and dignify other people by learning their stories and situations. But even that's not enough. Big heads, big hearts, that's great, but we also have to have strong hands that actually take action. And the commitment aspect gets to the laws and the policies that we need to tackle. For instance, voter suppression is still a very big deal. As we're recording this, it is the anniversary of the 15th Amendment, which granted the right for Black males to vote. And yet, In 2021, we're still facing issues of the right to vote being made difficult for certain groups of people. And we have to do something about that on a systemic level and policy level as well.
And so how involved should churches be with that? Should churches be on the front lines of these sort of political debates?
Martin Luther King Jr. said that he wished that instead of being the tail light, the church would be the headlight on these issues. And in many ways, the church can and should be the conscience of the nation, calling us to a higher standard of how we treat one another. And I do think we should be involved politically, because it is a fallacy to think that churches are not already involved politically, some more overtly than others. But I also think that when people hear political, they automatically think partisan. And there are ways to get involved politically without necessarily being partisan. For instance, a church can host a voter registration drive. That is allowed by law. You're not endorsing any particular candidate. And this is small d democracy. Whatever party